Hi there, can you hear? Ooh, mic. So, before I start, and I apologise for mangling the lyrics of not one but two Johnny Cash songs, could I just have a little show of hands of who's heard Friday night's episode? Okay, so all I'm having to say is I wrote this before Tim. Oh yeah. So last year I talked about Ambridge's offending population, and as a consequence of asking a friend of mine who's quite a senior police officer, I kept saying to her, can you tell me about your rural policing plan? And in the end she got so fed up with me doing that she told me to go and talk to her colleagues about their rural policing. And some of the things that I'm going to talk about today are based on those conversations and those activities that I did. So it's about rural crime in their areas and the challenges of rural police that rural police face locally, nationally and internationally. So I have to say that I did do this with trepidation. I'm a member of the British Society of Criminology, and we have a professional code of ethics, and that code of ethics says that I'm not allowed to publicly represent myself as an expert on something that I'm not. So I'm an expert on prisons and probation, and if Freddie had been put inside a little bit earlier, I would have been talking about something different indeed. But, you know, I'm not an expert on rural crime. I'm an expert on the policing of a very tiny rural population. But it's a tiny rural population that hasn't consented to take part in any of my research. So if Hannah likes to get wound up about the ethics of what's going on the parish council, then I think that she's probably coming for me next, or she's coming for me next after Natasha. So we have this idea about rural policing being tinged with nostalgia. It's imbued with the fairy tales of golden age of policing along with the rustic ideal. And I'm going to be a little nostalgic here. I'm going to think about this, last year when I talked about crime, and I talked about crime not being out of control in Ambridge. How wrong was I? So I suggested last year that the crimes of the middle classes of Ambridge were always treated as being only a flapjack. And it seemed as though that might have been a red rag to the scriptwriters. The red rag to people in Ambridge. And Brian has not been locked up. Freddie has. Ben and Rory seem to be getting away with joyriding, and Josh thinks that it's okay to defraud insurance companies. And really, thank goodness for Eddie's moral compass on that. And that's really not something that you hear every day. So this leads me to question, is Harrison the least interesting thing about Ambridge's crime and its management? The only thing interesting about Harrison is Fallon, quite frankly. But it also asks me to question, why won't the police let me talk to them about Ambridge, Aidensfield or Loch Dew? There we are. So in the last 5 years, the National Rural Crime Network has started its work. It's a collective of police and is supported by 30 police and crime commissioners who drive the objectives for their associated police constabularies. Now, while the network aims to help people feel and be safe, and to demonstrate that there's an understanding of the needs and worries of people living in rural communities, it still relies on the operational priorities of each constabulary to decide where to put resources. So, While at the Rural Affairs Summit last year, which I went to with the Rural Crime Network and lots of coppers, my God, I have to say that is the best day of my career. I got put in a 4x4, a police 4x4, driven down the A1 at speed with a police, what's they called? Quad bike on the back of this 4x4. I got to talk to the Sheep Association, who curiously were uninterested in my concerns about rare breeds and knitting, but that's entirely other matter. So during that session, I asked a rural crime lead from one of the larger constabularies just why it was that PC Burns was both the dedicated officer for Ambridge, but also policing nightclubs in Borchester. And I have to say, this man, who was standing behind me in the lunch queue, without missing a beat, said, "Well, that's pretty perceptive of you. I think that it just shows that Borchester's constabulary resources are just as stretched as ours are." And we just had this lovely conversation. So, strategic officers have to make a decision about how many operational officers to deploy in geographically large but sparsely populated areas. In some rural areas, if you look at the number of police per head of population, they're actually over-resourced. So my colleague from Northumberland may be surprised by that. I can't see where she is, yes. But understandably, the perceptions are quite different. Now, while 30 constabularies support the work of the National Rural Crime Network with staffing and dedicated officers to look at wildlife crime, sheep worrying, livestock crime, only 11 constabularies have paid to have their data analysed in the Rural Crime Survey of last year. Of the 20,000 people who took part in this survey, we know how many people from West Mercia, Warwickshire, Gloucestershire filled in the crime survey, but we know nothing more than that. We don't know those victims' concerns or fears or frustrations. And survey respondents were asked where the criminal incident they were a victim of took place. And I can only assume that people in Borchester and Borsetshire said, "I don't know." This table, which you really can't see very well, but if you have a look at the crime survey, you can see all of this data in its glory. So it sets out the occurrences of crimes that specific rural businesses, so farmers, landowners, rural vets, experienced between 2017 and 2018. And if I highlight just a few, we've got 18% who've had fly tipping on their land, 14% who've experienced hair coursing on their land, 11% have had agricultural machinery stolen. And then we've got, further down, 5% who've experienced sheep worrying and 4% have had theft of fuel. Now, I think that we've probably heard mention of fly tipping, and Josh clearly has had machinery stolen, but Harrison doesn't seem to have mentioned any of these other crimes. He doesn't seem to have picked up on this. So is it the case that Harrison isn't trustworthy, that people don't report crimes to him, or is it that Borsetshire's, that's difficult for me to say this morning, PCC doesn't care about rural crime and the impact of crimes on their rural communities? Quite frankly, they're missing a beat there. So, to be fair, there aren't many PCCs who have rural crime and policing as an objective in their plans. Sometimes you can count on the fingers of one hand the mentions of rural crime in PCC plans, and I've read a few. what's also concerning me is that it's almost impossible to get hold of the Dorsetshire Police and Crime Plan, and this is a real worry. They should be open, accountable, work along the Nolan principles, but it's not there online. I can't understand why. But we can see the ones of West Mercia and the ones of Gloucestershire. So West Mercia are talking about reassuring rural communities, and Gloucestershire are talking about accessibility and accountability, so they're talking about visible rural policing, and they're talking also about safer driving and reducing drink driving, and all of those are the concerns to the local areas in Gloucestershire. So if rural concerns are hardly mentioned in policing plans, is it any wonder that almost 3/4 of rural businesses who've been victims of crime feel frustrated, angry or disgusted with the way that they've been treated by the police? Police in rural areas walk this fine line between trying to manage all the competing demands on their time and resources, often in areas where other services are being cut. Okay, so one of the colleagues talked to me, one of the police officers said, I need the farmers on side to report things, but how do I support their wives who might be stuck in the farmhouse in the middle of nowhere with no access to any service provision? I thought, okay, this is a good chance. I'm going to talk about the Archers again, about intimate partner violence and policing, and I was met with a roll of the eyes and then a moving on. So police in rural areas deal with similar crimes to those in urban settings, but with a less frequency of them happening. Policing rural communities need to have a special set of social skills. They need to take part in monthly stops, have cups of tea, but they also need to take part in community and parish meetings where policing, crime and disorder is talked about. And again, I don't hear Harrison doing this. I only hear Harrison talking to elderly ladies when he's trying to butter them up so he can buy their house. So who is doing policing in rural communities? Susan, according to Susan last month, it's her. So in Ambridge, just as in Gloucestershire, there are concerns about driving safety. The parish council, although I'm still not convinced it was the parish council, as is its right and requirement, talked about crime and disorder and had the speeding initiative. But again, I can't remember, and I'm Harrison being involved in that, and I'm happy to be disabused of that fact. As a local officer, it's his role to take part in community policing initiatives. And I've not heard of him taking part in any community policing meetings. And I'm really wondering what the rural policing arrangements in Dorsetshire actually are. Police in other constabularies involve volunteers, gamekeepers, estate managers, people from wildlife organisations to take part in night operations where they patrol sections of the countryside, looking out for the things that might be suspicious or problematic or criminal. And I had the great pleasure of being involved in one of these. I went along to one of the sessions. We had a lovely briefing from the Chief Constable, who said on 3 occasions that it wasn't just a coincidence that he was there talking about rural crime. It wasn't just lip service. He said that 3 times in 15 minutes. So, but I was paired with an estate manager. So we went out to his 4x4. I opened the car door, moved his shepherd's crook, not a euphemism. I clambered into the 4x4. He turned the engine on. The radio blared. And ladies and gentlemen, it was 7 and he looked really embarrassed, and I thought it was delightful. So we drove around, we talked about crime, we talked about nuisance, we talked about the things that are being committed, and we talked about the fact that he thought that, a lot of this crime was being done by people from outside the community. But I imagine with the wave of young people that are about to come from downtown Felpersham that Kate's going to work with, there's going to be a perception in Ambridge that the crime rate and levels of nuisance are going to spike. So I'm expecting, just as Kenton, Roy and Jazza speculated this week, that Derek Fletcher is going to have a lot to say about this, and he's going to say it very loudly. I'm also concerned about Derek Fletcher being a proponent of hate crime, but I'll come back to that at another occasion. So it's clear that some rural communities and some rural crimes are committed by people in their community. As one of the coppers said to me, do you know what? It takes a lot of skill to round up 200 sheep in the dark. Right, so who should Harrison be looking for next? We know that many rural crimes can be linked back to organised crime. You start local and you get a bigger picture. Going onto a property to poach means that you can identify whether there are larger pieces of agricultural machinery and that can be stolen and shipped out of the country to order. Okay, this is what happens. So Adam might be regretting his vote in a recent referendum if his machinery does get nicked and the policing is not there, cross-border policing isn't there to get his things back. So my question is, if all of these things are linked to organised crime, who is it that Harrison should be looking for next? Tim? Well, yes. Before last night, I wouldn't have said Tim, but Tim. Anybody else? I'm suggesting Josh. Josh has got that second-hand agricultural business machinery thing going on. Anyway, or perhaps it's Leonard. And I love Leonard. He's marvellous. So Leonard, and the reason I say Leonard wondered whether Freddie might be able to cope with a large family gathering so soon after his release. And we know from the gossip in the kitchen at Brookfield that Leonard also, quotes, looked appalled when Ben pushed Freddie about what it was like to be inside. So this leads me to wonder whether Leonard has done a stretch himself. Oh yeah. And whether Leonard knows about the niceties of not asking other people about what they've done and what it's like inside. Or, quite simply, whether, as part of his training for being a volunteer at the Laurels, he's had a course on the hidden impact of imprisonment on family members. So it's either one or the other. So lastly, since his appraisal back at the end of last year, Harrison's been studying hard for his sergeant's exams, which he took along with all the other coppers in the country in the middle of March. And we know that's true because it was talked about in the book. If he's passed, then he's going to have to wait to see where he's going to be deployed. And he might continue to be a rural officer. But to be truthful, I'm concerned that Harrison hasn't been as effective as he might be. I'm also a bit concerned that I'm agreeing with Will, that Will has had the right to question Harrison's professional integrity. Has Harrison reached the College of Policing's 9th professional standard of behaviour relating to his conduct on or off duty? He should not bring discredit to the police service or undermine public confidence in policing. And all I'm saying is lying to the cricket team. In order for it even to be suggested that Harrison was in a position to study for his sergeant's exams, he will have to have demonstrated his competence in previous work. So to end, I'm just going to ask you the question about how good a copper Harrison is, and I'm going to leave that question hanging in the breeze, unlike the village fete paraphernalia.
So we do have esteemed colleagues from Borsetshire Police here today. As I say, we'll be policing the Academic Archers Conference in Sheffield this week. In case of any disorder arrests, please apply us a records of your past crimes to ease processing, and then go, actually, we've got one eye on you, one eye on the pastries. Any questions for Charlotte?
Can I ask what's your assessment of PC Burton's investigation into Matt Crawford and being run over?
All I can say is poor. You know, he didn't. I would suggest that he passed everything on, and he didn't do his job properly. He should be there to be sort of being the eyes and ears. And I'm entirely unconvinced that Harrison is doing anything other than being fed up by Fallon, and pieces of cake.
Very hazy recollection of Harrison doing some sort of crime prevention sort of discussions in the Bull once, and I think it's more part of his strategy of getting to know Farrell. And
Again.
also that he went to see, I think it was Jill when she was living alone in a cottage about some sort of break-in. Anyone else remember that? Because sort of very hazy, not recollection.
So he went round and did do his crime prevention work, yeah. So, but you know, as a rural copper, he should be holding regular meetings, quarterly meetings, along with the help of the parish council. So, you know, if the parish council are not as well developed as they might be, perhaps that goes hand in hand. But we rarely hear it. He should be going around having a little chat, having cups of coffee, and he's just, and lemon drizzle cake, and he's just not doing that.
Oh, it is on, I think. It's on. Oh,
No, the batteries run out. Oh no, it's on. It's
Yeah.
on now.
There we are.
Sorry, it's me. Sorry. So just yeah.
But what you're saying is that's happened in a lot of rural areas. We could, if you see a police car driving over Manning Road, you have a netting.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely.
Face down the platform. It could take 2 days to respond to anything, and then just gives you a window.
Yeah.
So there's no police presence.
And that's.
It's important on traffic offences. At least they don't have all these pickups so they can raise the speed limit so it doesn't get done. Now, there's not one of my crime officer, but just about all the traffic.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. In large geographical areas, and in my, I think that Borsetshire is probably smaller than Warwickshire, smaller than Gloucestershire. So certainly not large like West Mercia, which is an enormous area. If you look at the number of police that should be in those areas, by head of population, they are over-policed. And I absolutely understand. I don't know why I'm trying to defend the Borsetshire police here. I absolutely understand why the perception isn't there. But it's the phrase that has been used in rural policing work is fitting a 12-foot carpet to a 15-foot room, and they're trying to do that as well. Harrison's just a bit wet, quite frankly.
Can I just add, coming from rural Northumberland, like the young lady here, not a lot happens apart from between 7:03 and 7:15. We fondly remember the days 10 years ago when Northumbria police were overwhelmed by our escaped killer in the local village, Round Wood, the Geordie lad with the shotgun, not a nice chap. But it was so exciting. I was living with my ex-boyfriend then down the hill who farms a mile away from me, and we were asked to search our outbuildings, and on my way to work to to the university every day, I was stopped by 3 roadblocks with armed policemen. We were overwhelmed. We had the PSNI, the RUC as they then were, the Met, the flying squad. They were all there. And they did it. It took them over a week to find him. He was actually spotted in the local village going to the chippy. And the policeman spent most of the time in the local butchers going through the pie menu. We did a roaring trade.
It wasn't, I have to say, it wasn't just the residents. My colleagues were involved, and they were, it's an academic community. No, hang on. It's my colleagues were involved. They're academics. They're experts on policing. And one of my colleagues spent the week with Sky News talking about it. And he's also a very big Archers fan. But of course, it is massively exciting. That those things don't happen very often.
Yeah, no. But just in Harrison's defence, I think he may have missed his vacation.
Oh.
Natasha could do with a session with him. He's missed his vacation as a financial advisor.
Oh,
we all remember he set up a pension for planners. So,
Very good.
Sorry, I just asked a question. In terms of,
Don't stop apologising.
There you go.
I'm British. So, do you think that in the world of social media, the world will be for or against Mr. Burns? Because the reason I bring it up, a few weeks ago I was doing a lobby day in front of Parliament, and there was 2 different protests going on. There was against some sort of loan and pro-Brexit thing. And this police van just started reversing into me. I was standing at the Winston Churchill statues behind me, and my colleague got very scared and said, "What have you done?" And I thought, "Nothing, I'm just standing here." And these armed police came out, massive, very large guns. And the man came over to me and he said, "Oh, what are you up to today?" And I said, "I didn't do anything wrong." and he went, "I get that a lot." And so, as part of their community outreach, they literally just come to these marches and talk to people just to make them less scared of the police. And so I said, "Can I have a picture with you?" And then this woman came up and tried to take a picture.
And you're now dating.
He was a very large man, it's very broad. They were chatting to these other protesters, which was the pro-Brexit one. I think one of them was holding a sign saying, "Honk if you want to leave," or something like that. And someone took a picture with them. And when I went home that night, I put my picture on the internet and I tagged it as, I put it on Instagram, tagged it as, Parliament Square or whatever, and realised that that picture was on the internet and someone had written underneath, "These people were just trying to protest," and the police came and broke it up. But they were not.
Yeah.
They chatted to me, they chatted to everyone around me, they were asking about what I work for, the people in front of me they took a picture of, they were talking about cakes. Everyone loves cake.
There's some really interesting discussions about how the police, including Dorsetshire, use social media, and I'm happy to talk to you about that in the break.
Yeah, very good.
One more question.
Yeah, come on.
Well, I'm from rural Lancashire as well, and I can just comment that Dorsetshire is obviously a more peaceful place than Lancashire, because we were at the village annual parish council annual meeting, which does take place in our village. The representative from the police who was there was asked about these teams of volunteers doing speed gun surveys, as we've heard happening in Ambridge. They take place in Cumbria, which is half a mile away from our village. In Lancashire, they're not allowed to take place unless there's a police officer with the volunteers in case of violence. So the Dorsetshire police are obviously confident there will not be a threat of violence to volunteers.
Well, I think that probably they're not going to put Jim and Shula together on speed camera.
It reminds me, thank you, Charlotte.